will start to introduce who we have. So I'll start with our gentleman here on stage. Thank you so much for joining us. Mario Klapsis, VP Financial Services and GM for UK for Trustly. And we also have with us Gerard Grech, Founding Chief Executive of TechNation. So extremely pleased that you're here. If technology works, it would be, oh, here we go. I was so worried that exactly on this one, technology would not work for us. So a big welcome to Henrik Tjärnström, CEO of Kindred Group, and Dan Hill, Director of Strategic Design at Vinnova. Thank you for joining us. We would have loved to have you in the room, but it's excellent and great that you're here. I'd like to start off. There's so many different questions you can talk about on this topic. I'd like to start off by you doing your top of minds here, 1 to 2 minutes on what are your issues and what are you thinking about on this topic. Let's start, Dan. Why don't we start with you? We'll start on the screen, I think.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Great. So yeah, I'm very interested in this sense of speeding up and slowing down, and maybe want to take a contrary view to get the conversation going. I was very influenced last year by a book by an Oxford University professor called Danny Dorling, who wrote a book called Slow Down. And he makes the case that actually everything is slowing down. So population growth is slowing down, the rate of population growth, that is. He argues the rate of technology innovation is also slowing down, which is controversial but interesting. He sort of makes the claim that 1880 to 1920, there was a lot of amazing tech happening, but now we're sort of beginning to slow down. This kind of thesis he explores across multiple dimensions, and he sees it actually as very positive, and I also share that to some degree. If we can adapt to that sense of, for instance, GDP per capita slowing down, it might enable us to think about a more regenerative economy, a different kind of growth perhaps. So I think where I'd like to start my positioning here is there are some things that do speed up, obviously, but in order to slow down. So we can certainly speed up unnecessary bureaucratic processes, for instance, and therefore buy more time, if you like, to spend time on different kinds of growth or more relationships with each other, relationships with places and things like that. So it's not as if everything is speeding up, and in reality, of course, it's not like everything is slowing down. Some things are speeding up, some things are slowing down. So I want to talk about what would it be good to slow down, and what is it good to speed up. That would be my starting point.
Very interesting. Thank you, Dan. Let's hear what Henrik has on his mind.
Yeah. Hello, Elaine. Now, clearly, we all consumers in.
Can we get more sound? Sorry, we hear you.
You hear me well?
Not that well.
Okay.
Yes, better. Thank you.
Okay. No. So we of course valid points by Dan as well, but we as kind of being born in the digital area as Kindred and in our company, what we see and what we all know, of course, is that the fact that how we engage and communicate with our customers indeed can make or break the relationship we have with the customers. And of course, we all know that customers of today, we are all in the digital arena, and we know that there's an ever-pressing need for kind of speed, and everyone wants things to be better, faster, and also more personalized. And at the other end of the scale, of course, is about data and the need for data. I think that's a topic that we've seen over the last couple of years that's of importance, and how companies and organization with the consumers' data. And of course, we have the dilemma on the balance between offering that kind of good and relevant experience, and at the same time protecting the customer's integrity. And of course, where do we draw the line? And it's not clear in the sense, are the customers really aware of what they're asking for, in the sense, if they really want that personalized and fast experience, the kind of amount of data that companies and organizations really need to offer that.
Yeah, that is really interesting. We're going to come back to data a lot, I think. So thank you, Henrik. We'll move over to Mario.
Thank you. Given the discussion we had in the morning and the opinions that we shared, I would also like to be a little bit contrarian by actually being a little bit more optimistic. From a fintech world perspective, we are focusing right now, we as Trustly, but all other companies in the fintech space, which is a very large space, very much into influencing how people buy, how people pay, how people play, how people interact with each other. And there is a lot of sources of growth, very exciting sources, like technology, as also presented very nicely before, regulation, which is a very strong enabling factor, and a factor that brings a lot of clarity in how to do business, in a way that we can actually leverage what we have in our hands and deliver new types of solutions, new types of options, and at the end of the day, influence positively, in my opinion, people in their lifestyle to make those choices, adopt the ones that make sense to themselves, but also to enable businesses, whether existing or new ones that are being created, to leverage what is out there, operate in a different way. And at the end of the day, where does this lead? In my opinion, it leads into two very specific directions. The one is all around options and choices that people have. The second is very much around trade. And at the end of the day, the digital economy and the speed of the digital economy, yes, there are perhaps, as we heard this morning, a lot of clouds in the sky, a lot of issues, but if we try to see a little bit beyond the short term, there is actually a clear direction of growth, and that underlines trade growth.
Interesting connections to that as well. Thank you, Mario. So let's go to Gerard. What are you thinking of?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here. When you look at this at a macro level, when you look at it in isolation, the digital economy here in the UK, for example, is moving at 6 times faster than the rest of the economy. So that, with that comes opportunities in terms of high-paying jobs, but also people being potentially left behind. That's one area. So we get to see quite a lot of the companies that then become unicorns. So we see their practices from a business standpoint. So what I see are 3 things, and some of it actually resonates with what Dan was talking about. So on the one hand, we talk about speed of expectations, either from a citizen or from a consumer. Businesses responding to that. And then you have the citizen stroke consumer stroke employee colleague who's actually needing to slow down. So businesses wanting to go fast because either they're sort of getting capital or doubling their revenues, especially right now with COVID, it's accelerating the digital economy in so many ways. The more there is for that to happen at a macro level, the more at a micro level, there needs to be a slowdown. More mindfulness, we've put so many things into place as an organization. We're a 120 people organization, and we have given up some of our office space and literally just redirected that money into people's learning and development and adaptation. Because technology is great. I mean, we all know what technology can do, but the adaptation of people, whether you're 50 years old or 24 years old, you need to invest in that. So those are 2 areas that I would say are quite important, that is happening. And then on top of that, geopolitically, you have the emergence of 2 platforms, I would say. I'm just being very careful here. And that's because there has never been more accelerated agreement on data, sovereignty, data traps, death traps, and data underpinning so many of our interrelationships at a political and jurisdiction level. And so there's a gap between the businesses and governments to some extent, but actually governments are responding. And I've never seen so much consensus on this. And that obviously may, on one hand, means that more regulation in a good way, because it unlocks more growth, but I've never seen so much consensus now that will have a positive and another form of positivity on businesses and consumers.
Thank you so much. This is really interesting, and I'm going to come back to connecting some of these. But I wanted just to turn to the audience. Anybody who wants to share how does this feel after Åsa's keynote and these top of minds? Anybody who wants to share? Yes, please. Yes.
you kindly referred to me as the fibre man when we
Fibre
fibre man as we chatted earlier on. The fibre industry is interesting because as the country manager for the UK with a Swedish company, we're talking about two countries that are either end of the spectrum on fibre infrastructure. You've got Sweden at the top of the scale and has been for 15 years.
Yeah.
And you've got the UK that only appeared in terms of fibre connectivity in the Fibre to the Home Council statistics in 2019. We are in a massive catch-up zone. The infrastructure is a platform for innovation, and everywhere in Europe is further advanced than the UK in that. Now, we're catching up because there's a massive land grab of fibre in the UK. But whilst that infrastructure will happen now in an accelerated way over the next 3 or 4 years, with billions of pounds going into it, the adoption of that fibre, government need to be part of that because the messaging of fibre is not understood in the UK. People still talk about, I mean, we have a copper hybrid solution, majority in the UK. So this adoption is going to be really key because the speed of digital economy in everything from public sector services and education and health, as well as the gaming and entertainment sector, needs to be adopted by all parties. And the messaging and the education is going to be a key factor so that you can get that bedrock of infrastructure for innovation.
That's really, and it's interesting comparing some countries on this because connectivity is definitely the foundation for all of that. I have so many places we could take this conversation, but I'm thinking that slowdown really got me thinking we need to come back to that. But I think maybe to take one inroad of where Åsa was as well, the technology change creates new opportunities and helps us solve many societal challenges, including sustainability and inclusion. But I had asked a question here, are there any risks with the speed of technology? And you have some have touched upon that, but also how immersive it has become in our lives. It's not just to download music on Spotify any longer, or even, with all your respect for Kindred, Henrik, entertain myself. It's immersive, right? So are we seeing risks with this, in addition to the opportunities? Who wants to start?
If I may
Mario, please,
take
yes.
this, there are risks, and it's very easy perhaps as a starting point to paint a very positive picture about where we are, but the positivity is very much around the speed that we are experiencing, and there are risks, and that's natural. A couple of examples. One of the emerging themes that already a number of people refer to it is data and the use of data. We're moving in a direction where each one of us will be able to have access and ownership of our data, of our identity, who we are in a digital environment, so can actually use it to access something we want to, again, buy, pay, play, interact, or whatever it is that we may want to apply it. There are ethical dimensions on the use and ownership of data. There are actually practical questions that a regulator or a government or a set of governments in a regional framework, whatever the specific structure is, they need to actually think about and decide and regulate and enable actually that direction of growth. Another one that is a risk is very much what you referred to in terms of inclusion. We are talking a lot about growth in the digital economy, yet there is actually a portion of the population that may be non-banked or underbanked. And actually, we very many times when we discuss about this subject, we'll refer to third world countries or we'll refer to the US that has a massive, like close to 20% of the population being in this both non and underbanked. But even if we look at our country here, that is an issue. So when the technologies and the application of technology is speeding up so much and so fast, where do we leave these people behind? And what's the joint responsibility we have as people in this ecosystem to actually carry them along with us versus leaving them behind?
Yes, if I may add to that, I think, just briefly, because I'm very conscious of time, I think there are two potential risks that are also opportunities. One is the fact that governments are really stepping up. I don't know if you saw, but the UK government actually published guidelines on transparency of algorithms only 2 days ago. And I think I think management by algorithms is something that we're becoming very aware of, and clearly we all know that there are biases within algorithms because they're designed by humans who have a certain programming that's been brought up in a certain way, and they think the world works in their way, when actually, how do you ethically create the environment where people are actually very aware of multiple constituents that live in a society? So on the one hand, I'm seeing really good stuff. Was with future leaders from Latvia, Lithuania, Sweden, Finland only on Friday talking about this. This is very, very positive. On the second thing, this is a risk, but it's also an opportunity. So I've never seen so much venture capital coming into the UK. We're going to hit another record high of $40 billion in the UK alone, which is twice what it was last year and 3 times what it was 2 years ago. So there's all this capital coming in, which is going to fuel a lot of innovation, and that's going to create its own kind of set of conditions where you have a number of companies accelerating forward, creating high-paid jobs. And how do you make sure that the long tail of companies adapt their rhythms and business practices and tools and everything else to catch up and make sure they're not left behind, because consumers will become more demanding. So it's both a positive and a not so positive, but I think overall, we're about to enter the most exciting decade in entrepreneurship in human history.
That's a wonderful tagline to take with us. Henrik, I think maybe, do you want to comment? I know you work with this, the opportunity and the risk side every single day in your company, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we of course, very relevant points being discussed already. But on top of that, what we see is as well that we have, clearly, as I mentioned, about the personalized data and the personalized experience that we have. But at the same time, we also have regulatory situation to manage as well. And for us, it's a little bit of a tug of war between different interests. We have the customers that wants the personalized and fast and relevant experience, and then we have sort of the GDPR aspects of things and how we can manage that. But we have anti-money laundering and regulatory issues that are pulling things in another direction. So in some ways, we're asked to not keep any data on the customers, but at the same time, we need to keep data for the sake of regulations and being compliant as well. And it's about finding that sort of ever-present balance. And of course, the other obvious risks in society with this speed and everything is about kind of inclusion and as we're touched on here today as well, that with the stress levels and consequences for society in general about people wanting to keep up with development and seeing the next of kin in a sense being so into technology and then you sort of being dragged on to that even if you perhaps don't have a clear need for it in a sense as well. But it's kind of finding that balance where technology can really support our everyday life in the right way and not sort of too much and creating a problem.
Yeah, and I think, Dan, you kicked us off in this whole the topic here is speed, and you started with slowdown. I think it's just really interesting. I would like to tie this back to this actually. How do we deal with that? How do we live in this pace of technology and this drive and the exponential? And then we think about the things that have been said here too. How do we bring other companies with us who may not be that 6 times X development, or the individuals, or how do we have a life that actually works in that? And I thought it was just really interesting how you started with your slowdown thought.
Yeah, I mean, and relating to your previous question, I think there's a couple of things to think about. One is this sort of range of products or services or things that we might make, which are more diverse, perhaps. So, one thing I worked on as a designer was this cell phone. I won't advertise it. It's just, but it just does calls and texts, and that's all it does. And it's actually got Android inside it, but we kind of shoved Android under the hood so far that it just does the calls and texts. So it gives you another option, and you can use this alongside your smartphone, and you now have this choice. You can say, well, actually, I want to go into this mode, and you can get me if you need to, but otherwise I'm going to, take attention to look at my kids or to look at nature around me. I'm not going to think about Instagram. I'm just going to, liaise with my family. So I can do that, or I can switch back to the smartphone mode. And so now I have this choice. So one thing is, how do we get this diversity of tech in play that's much richer? And my background is kind of working with cities and things, and I work in the Swedish government, and so we're trying to understand how do you bring in these fast-moving technologies, for instance, e-scooters, or before that, things like ride-sharing, but do that in a way that produces a good city. Yeah. And a good city is a much more complex thing than just making a scooter or Uber, for example, or Lyft or whatever. It's actually got to fit into many different things. We know the city's got to have bikes and buses and wheelchairs as well as Uber and e-scooters. So we're looking at this much more, again, diverse range of things. Some things new, some things old. My role here is to say, well, again, government shouldn't just sort of sit back and wait for the market just to sort of find a position on things. We need to be an active collaborator there. And I think that's maybe a Swedish or Nordic approach, perhaps, to where we have these public-private partnerships now for a good 100 years or so. The broadband infrastructure, for instance, that the person in the audience mentioned, in Stockholm, that's been a city-run company, so owned by the people of Stockholm, as well as running private companies on top of that. So we can find these balancing acts. But as a lot of, I think, the other speakers are saying, we need to engage with the reality of the tech. We need to move quickly in order to make decisions about what would be a good, equitable outcome for society. So that's the way I think about it, is to understand all of these fast-moving tech in detail, talk to them, liaise with them, but then find a position that makes sense for everybody. That's, for instance, our role as government. We have to make it work for everybody in that sense.
And I think no offense on this, but I think some of us may not think of the government agencies as being the most fast-moving in our lives, and you work from one. So is there something we need to do differently in those organizations that we maybe don't feel move as quickly as many of the other organizations in our lives?
Absolutely, and of course that's is true. Our job sometimes is to slow down, though. Sometimes our job is to slow down, look at the longer term view and the big picture, because we have to take hard decisions, equitable decisions. So, with ride sharing, for instance, it's easier if you're a startup in a sense. It's the easiest thing in the world to make something that doesn't try to integrate with public transport or, city services or produce an equitable outcome. Something like Transport for London, though, has to work for everybody. Has to be the same price, whether it's a granny coming in from outside of the city or somebody living in Clerkenwell or Shoreditch. Much, much harder. So I think, for instance, there's a reason why we sometimes slow down. What's important, I think, is to be proactive about it, though, and also to move quickly. So, for instance, when a certain ride-sharing company moved into Seoul in South Korea, the city government there said, well, you know what, that's just a good app liaising with a bunch of taxis. That's all it is. And they made the app themselves. I mean, an app can be done by 20 or 30 people in a room with a bit of backroom support. Fine. It's not hard technically, actually, to do that. So the city government made the app that had exactly the same qualities as the startups. And of course, that way the value was then shared across the whole city. And it could be integrated much better, and the return goes back to the public. Still the same tech in play in both cases, both using machine learning and advanced technologies and mobile technologies and so on. So government can move quickly, absolutely. It also has a responsibility to slow down, and so that's all I was saying really. Which gear are we in, and what are the outcomes?
Yeah, which gear are we in? I think that's a really good one. We have a really interesting question here from the audience, which is saying, aren't digital platforms, Google, Amazon, Facebook, the new global superpowers? Isn't that the level of digitalization a threat to freedom and democracy? Who feels to be in the right seat? Maybe we need to get Nick on stage.
You're looking at me? No.
Anything? It's a big question, right? And it's in media.
Well,
I feel like Gerard has a...
Well, look, I'm not here to represent anybody in particular. I'm sure. I think there is more discourse in certain networks about influence ethically. How do you influence people ethically? I mean, even that sounds kind of contradictory in itself, right? But we do it every day, whether it's a journalist trying to influence his or her editor to publish a story, it is influence. And there's a way in which I think there's much more awareness, consciousness awareness about how things ought to be designed, how products ought to be designed and deployed. We're not there yet, but I think I would say that a lot of government-backed institutions now that are not funded by other institutions are really moving in. And they're saying, actually, enough is enough. And I think we need to think about values-based design, diplomacy, sovereignty, data sovereignty. And I think that is just now really, I've never seen it accelerate so much, because it was talked about before COVID, but COVID somehow has accelerated so much, made people aware of so many things, that people now have just, there's been a knee-jerk reaction to it. There's nothing wrong with that. Now we just need to think about it. But people, the one thing, going back to the point that you were saying is, yes, these big companies have now entered the living room. You know, and we're all aware of a term called FOMO, which is fear of missing out. I've come across a new term, which is HOGO, which is hassle of going out. And I think that's something we need to be aware of, that, you know, I've got my deliveries, I've got my entertainment, I can do my work from home, I don't need to go out, I don't need to socialize. And I think that is where, if we publicly talk about this narrative, I think the people that work in these companies are humans. You know, they're not robots. So they are the ones designing our everyday world. So there's nothing stopping us from actually being more publicly, voting with our feet, and consuming things that we think are ethical and sustainable for a more equitable society. It's our choice. We have a daily choice to make about that. So I think you'll see a lot more of that narrative coming in and at speed.
Then it's an awareness question, right? Because what you just talked about is the question of being aware of that.
100%.
I sometimes think about it, whatever service I'm using for free means that I'm paying with my data. And then you know that that's going to be used for forming a number of different opinions and others that will then hit me, because nothing is really for free.
And
I think that's a...
One has to be very consciously aware of what you do on, whether you're using Twitter or Facebook. It's amazing how much I've had to consciously step up about managing my own terms and conditions with these entities.
It's another big thing, I think. Anybody who wants to add anything to that?
Yeah, but the one thing that you can't compromise on is, of course, trust. As we say, that's trust is something you earn from the customers and your fellow citizens, in a sense, and you can't abuse that, and then you're on a very slippery slope. So I think that's a key one where people really sit on full power still, and I think that's what's driving the kind of the behavior as well that we've seen over the last couple of years, when it's sort of more of a swing back towards the consumers as well, and to gain their trust, and consumers will spend their time and effort where they feel trust and get a safe and secure experience.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that's a key word. So we've gone on to a few different things, and I'm curious, I know we're running out of time, but how do you, each one of you, irrespective if you're doing it slowly or quickly, how do you think about what is next? How do you drive your teams and organizations to create the new opportunities? What does that look like? And I know it's a very diverse opportunity of answers, but Mario, do you want to start?
I will try to answer in a little bit of a practical way, because we can, of course, talk about principles, etc., but there's also a practical dimension to what we do in our everyday life. As a fintech company, we influence how our merchants, in our case, operate, because we actually influence the way that an end consumer would pay. So we actually spend a lot of time in understanding what are the merchants' needs, and how can we help them. So there's a difference between having a package solution saying, here it is, it looks amazing, it uses this latest technology, it's this, that, the other, etc., versus this is actually how can improve your business, and trying to drive those merchants along that journey that we think can be mutually beneficial. And at the end of the day, it's got to be beneficial for the consumer, because tying back to what I mentioned up front, we're giving choices to consumers. So there has to be a value add. Otherwise, you're just doing a feature, or you're doing something that looks or sounds interesting. So taking that practical step of understanding those businesses and how to actually create that incremental change may sound mundane, but actually it does have a proper and distinct impact.
Excellent. That outside-in design. I feel like Dan wants to jump into that point.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's been core to our work. Coming from a design background, again, is to. I mean, principles are kind of useless unless they're in practice. So we drag those down to the ground into prototypes, and we prototype those in public life. So the thing that actually we just also heard about, this, what was it, hassle of going out, the sense that suddenly everything comes to you. You don't go into the city centre or your office or whatever. I'm very aware I'm saying this sitting at home, by the way. But we want to understand, so what kind of neighbourhood is that? Because that's actually maybe really interesting. If we can reduce the amount of traffic going into the city centre for 2 or 3 days a week, that's amazing, actually, in terms of carbon emissions and noise and health and all kinds of stuff. But the corollary of that is the neighbourhood also has to be super interesting and vibrant as a place to live and work and play as well. You don't just have all of your entertainment in the centre and then nothing in the neighbourhood. You can just sleep there. So we want this kind of much more interesting city with multiple choices. You can go into town, you can stay in the suburb. Either way, it's good and healthy and sustainable. So those are the principles, and then we pull them into practice. And real life prototypes on the streets. We're running a mission to retrofit all the streets in Sweden to be healthy, sustainable and vibrant. And frankly, that means a reduction in car traffic and a reduction in car parking space. But we do that with Volvo cars, for instance, as one of the partners, and Voi scooters, I mentioned them earlier, along with municipalities like Gothenburg and Stockholm and others. And then we produce prototypes in public, testing different kinds of streets designs with residents. And what we're finding, we actually had school kids redesigning the street that their schools were on. And we're finding that citizens were 75% in favor of these kind of changes. So replacing parking spaces with greenery and social spaces and so on, and bike parking, etc. So the argument over principles is really hard, because there's pro cars, anti cars. You get into this very abstract, almost political debate. Drag it down to the street, build something with residents, and we found that actually people start massively motivating for greener, healthier, cleaner, more sustainable streets in that way, purely by being part of the process, along with private and public sector working together. So that's what we're trying to do, change the practice of government in that respect. And
I think the principle there to be, from both of you, like to be really focused on the user and the benefit and the value you're creating. And I think that's interesting way to fed in that. And I do believe that's how you can put technology to use. Yes, Gerard.
Just if I may, to add to that, when we looked at this, when people started working from home, we really looked at what are we going to do to make sure that this is a productive way of working, because we had not been in the situation before. And the difference between an average manual worker and the best manual worker is 2x. The difference between an average knowledge worker and the best knowledge worker is 10x.
Yeah, that's so
and that comes down to well-being. The productivity element is so associated with their environment. And to Dan's point, we are a new company that's come up in the UK called Patch Don't Work, which is this third space. So it's not working from home, it's not working from the office, but it's working in a space, a shared space with your local community.
Yeah, exactly.
You're all freelancers or working for a company, but you're working together because belonging is such an important part of human need.
Yeah.
And so that relates back to productivity, and also it puts a positive business case for the company.
Thank you. That's a really good input. And Henrik, anything from you on that thought?
Very good thoughts. And clearly for us at Kindred, we have redesigned our delivery models to really make sure that we are customer-led and insights-driven, and of course fast and also connected in a sense. So we really make sure that we put customer at the center of what we do most of the time. The customer lens on how we deliver change and improvements and our services towards the customer. And we clearly going forward, we want to take that to the next level as well. And it's 3 things that we normally talk about in this, and it's about speed, relevancy, and also trust. And as I mentioned, and about building that trust with the customer that it's so important for us to have with the customers. And I think that goes for all of us. So I think that's a really key one, and as well to keep at the center of everything. And then of course cybercrime and everything that's coming our way as a digital company and the digital industry. I think that's something that's getting onto the radar of late in a sense, but I think that's pretty much a topic of its own in a sense. And being compliant is not enough. We need to sort of lead at the forefront of this, and then being compliant just comes as a byproduct from that. But that is something we see, and it's something that's featuring extremely high on our stakeholders' agenda and questions that we get, in a sense, on the vulnerability on cyber situation that is sort of just increasing.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Henrik. Anything more from the audience? Anything we haven't picked up here? Nothing that I can see. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you. And I think about it, it's really fascinating because we have 4 real digital forerunners in this room, and you all put people in the center and technology as an enabler. And I think that's one of the critical success factors. And with all the risks we have identified and talked about, it's clear that there are huge opportunities, and not just opportunities, a necessity, I would say, to actually solve our climate crisis and the climate emergency. And so with that, I'd like to thank the panel and hand the floor back to Nick and move into the next panel.